You're jealous. That's all this is. My mother said it across the dinner table while my father signed the check for $138,000 and slid it toward my sister. I asked why the money that had my name on it for 18 years was suddenly hers. My father didn't look up. Because she needs it more, and you need to stop making everything about you. They skipped my wedding, told every relative I had been disowned for greed. For 3 years I let them keep the story. Then a lawyer called. His voice was polite, almost bored. Your father needs your signature, urgently. It's just a formality to close the sale of the family business. I opened the document. I read the second page twice, and for the first time in 3 years I smiled. My name is Wendy Baker, 29 years old. They wrote me out of the family. They forgot one thing that could not be rewritten. Welcome back to Bittersweet Stories. Get comfortable. The people in this story had every chance to do the right thing. They just didn't. Drop a comment and subscribe. You're going to want to stay for what happens next. Let me tell you about the two kinds of children in my family, because that's really where all of this begins. There was the strong one and the one who needed help. I was the strong one. That sounds like a compliment until you understand how it was used. When I was 9 and Reagan was 6, our mother made a chore chart and taped it to the refrigerator. My name filled 3 columns. Reagan's name appeared once, next to help set the table when she feels up to it. That chart hung there for years, and no one ever thought it was strange. I certainly didn't. I thought being trusted with more meant I was loved more. It took me a long time to learn those aren't the same thing. My mother, Nadine, had a way of framing everything so that it sounded reasonable. You've always been our strong one, honey, she'd say. Reagan just needs more help. And what could you say to that? If you argued, you were proving you weren't strong. If you agreed, you signed up for more. Either way, she won, and she never once had to raise her voice to do it. My father, Warren, controlled a different way. He controlled with attention. He gave it to Reagan and withheld it from me, and he did it so consistently that I stopped noticing when it was happening, and only noticed the absence, like a room that's always a little too cold. He ran the family business, and he ran the family the same way, deciding who got invested in and who was expected to return a profit on their own. The person who saw me was my grandfather. Gideon Baker built Baker and Vine out of a hillside outside Charlottesville, Virginia, back in 1978, when everyone told him Virginia wasn't wine country, and he decided they were wrong. By the time I was old enough to help, it was a real winery, 26 people on the payroll, a bottling line, a tasting room, and rows of vines he'd planted with his own hands. He used to walk me down the oldest row and put his hand flat against a gnarled trunk. This row outlives everyone who forgets who planted it, he told me once. I was maybe 11. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. He had a fountain pen, black, heavy, older than me. He signed everything with it and never let anyone else touch it. A signature is a promise when, he said, you don't hand your promise to just anybody. He let me help with real work, not pretend work. He let me fail and try again. And once, when I did something small and competent without being asked, he gave me a card with a name and a phone number on it and told me to keep it in my wallet. Emmett Shaw, my lawyer. If anything's ever wrong and you can't reach me, you call this man. I was 14. I put it in my wallet and forgot about it for years. When I was 18, my grandfather did something I didn't understand until much later. We were at his kitchen table. He slid a check across the wood toward me, face down, and told me it would cover all 4 years of college. I looked at it. I thought about my parents, about the way everything in our house came with a ledger, about how I wanted at least one thing in my life that no one could hold over me. I pushed it back. I'd rather earn it, I said. My father laughed from the doorway and called me proud and foolish. My mother said something about not being able to help people who won't be helped. But my grandfather didn't laugh. He looked at me for a long moment, then folded the check and put it back in his shirt pocket without a word. I'll remember you said that, he told me. 11 years later, I'd finally understand how much that sentence weighed. The thing about being the strong child is that people speak for you. Reagan did it constantly. At family dinners, before I could answer a question, she'd jump in. "She's fine with it. She always is. Right, Wen?" And I'd nod, because disagreeing meant a scene, and scenes were something only Reagan was allowed to have. In every family photo from those years, I'm standing at the edge of the frame, half in, half out, like the photographer wasn't sure I'd be staying. There's a version of this story where I tell you I was miserable my whole childhood. That's not true, and I don't want to lie to you. I had a grandfather who saw me. I had my own stubbornness, which turned out to be worth more than the college fund. And I had the belief, quiet and constant, that if I just kept being good enough, kept being useful enough, eventually my parents would look at me the way my grandfather did. I built my whole young life on that belief. I want you to remember that, because everything that happened later was the sound of that belief finally breaking. The college fund was always described as mine. That's the part that still catches in my throat. It wasn't a vague family pot. For 18 years, my parents called it Wendy's Fund. It was an account in their names. I want to be honest about that. It was legally theirs to control, but they had promised it to me since I was small. Your start in life, my father called it. When I got into college, they sat me down and made it sound generous. "Leave it with us, sweetheart. It's your start. We'll be there when it really counts, when you need it for something big." So I left it. I took out loans instead, $61,000 of them, and I told myself I was protecting my future by not touching the fund too early. I saw the balance exactly once. My mother had left a statement on the counter, and I glanced at it before she snatched it up. 6 figures. A note on the account. Wendy, Start Fund. I remember feeling safe when I saw it. I remember thinking, they really did keep their promise. I graduated at 22 with a degree, and my loans and a job managing a veterinary clinic that I actually loved. For 3 years, the fund just sat in the back of my mind, patient, waiting for the day I'd need it for something big. A house, grad school, a start. Then came the dinner in December. I was 25. Reagan was 22, fresh out of school with a communications degree and a lot of opinions about what she deserved. We were all at my parents' table, and there was a strange energy in the room, the kind you feel before you understand it. My father took out his checkbook. He wrote a number. He tore the check along the perforation, and the sound of it was very loud, and he slid it across the table to Reagan. I saw the number. $138,000. "What is that?" I asked. "It's Reagan's," my mother said, like I'd asked something rude. I looked at the account line on the check, and I recognized it. I'd seen it once, on a statement, on a counter, years ago. "That's the fund," I said. "That's my fund. That money's had my name on it for 18 years. My father didn't look up. He capped his pen. "Because she needs it more. And you need to stop making everything about you." Reagan didn't say anything. She just reached out and pulled the check a little closer, the way you'd pull a plate toward you at a table where you weren't sure there'd be enough. "You're jealous," my mother said. "That's all this is." I want to tell you I stood up and gave a speech. I didn't. I sat there and something in me that had been holding a rope for 25 years finally let go. It wasn't the money that broke it. I need you to understand that. It was the word. Because here is what jealous did. It took the thing they had done to me and turned it into a flaw in me. It said, "You have no right to be upset, and if you are, that's just further proof of what's wrong with you." In one word, they robbed me and made the robbery my fault. The word spread. That's how these things work in families. Within a week it had traveled through this group chat, through the aunts, through the cousins. Reagan posted something vague and grateful about family, and everyone loved it. When I finally texted her that what they'd done wasn't okay, she wrote back, "Everyone can see you're just jealous. It's not a good look." Little hearts appeared under her message from people who'd known me my whole life. Not one of them asked me what happened. That was the night I understood the truth of my family. They hadn't just taken my money, they had taken my right to be upset about it. And a family that decides you're not allowed to feel the thing they did to you isn't a family you can reason with. It's a family you have to leave. So I left, not with a scene. I wasn't allowed those anyway. I just stopped answering. I saved my parents' number in my phone under Do Not Answer, and I noticed even then that I hadn't deleted it. I left one thin thread. I told myself it was in case of emergency. Maybe it was. Maybe I just wasn't ready to admit that a door, once closed, could still be a door. 3 years later, that thread would ring. I built a life in Nashville, and I built it with my own hands, and no one gave me a check for any of it. I paid down the loans. I met Elliot Frost, a high school science teacher with a patience I didn't know people had, and I married him, and 18 months after that, we bought a small house with a crooked porch that we loved anyway. I was good at my job. The clinic ran better because I ran it. I had a life that was quiet and real and mine. Elliot didn't push me about my family. Early on, he asked once, carefully, and I told him the short version. You don't talk about them much, he said later, when he'd earned the right to notice. There's not much left to say, I told him. And for a long time, that was true. There was one thing I kept, a reserve bottle from the winery, the good stuff, with my grandfather's initials etched into the glass, GB. He'd given it to me years before, told me to open it on a day worth remembering. It sat on a shelf in our kitchen, unopened, through everything. I'm not sure why I never opened it. Maybe I was waiting for a day that felt earned. Maybe I already knew, somewhere, that the day would come, and that I'd want to be sure before I broke the seal. We got married in June, 3 years ago now. I sent my parents an invitation. I want to be clear about why, because it wasn't weakness. It was an olive branch, and it was also a test, and some part of me needed to know for certain. I set the invitation into the mail and I let myself hope for about a day. They didn't respond. They didn't come. At the reception, I'd told the coordinator to leave 2 seats in the front row, and I couldn't tell you now whether that was hope or habit. The seats stayed empty through the whole ceremony. The invitation came back weeks later in a returned envelope, unopened, and I understood that they hadn't even needed to read it to say no. A cousin texted me a few weeks after the wedding. Delia, who I'd been close to as a kid. I thought she was writing to say she was sorry she'd missed it. After everything they did for you, she wrote, disowning you was kind. I read it 3 times. Disowned. That was the word they'd chosen, and they'd sent it out into the family the way you'd release something into water and let the current carry it. My mother had posted, around that time, one of those soft, poisonous lines. Some children forget where they came from. 100 people who had never once called to ask me my side clicked their approval. I could have fought it. I could have gone relative by relative with my own version. I chose not to. I thought the false story was harmless, that it lived only in a family I'd already left, that it couldn't reach me in the life I'd built. I was wrong about how harmless it was, but that's a lesson for later. At the time, I just wanted to be left alone, and letting them be right in a room I wasn't in seemed like the cheapest possible peace. There was a grief in it I didn't expect. Not for my parents. For the family I'd once believed I was part of, the one where being strong meant being loved. That family had never really existed. But you can still mourn a thing that was only ever a hope. My grandfather died that September. I found out late. This is the part that still costs me something to say. When I cut contact with my parents, I lost my line to him too. I was 81, and he'd never been good with phones, and my parents were the ones who managed his life by then. They didn't tell me he was sick. They didn't tell me he was fading. I found out he was gone from an acquaintance who assumed I already knew, and by then the funeral was over. I stood in my kitchen the night I heard, and I put my hand flat on that reserve bottle, on the cold curve of the glass over his initials, the way he used to put his hand on the trunk of the oldest vine. I didn't open it, I just stood there for a while. Someone told me later that my Aunt Harriet had said something at the reception after the funeral. He knew exactly what he was doing at the end, she'd said, to no one in particular. Don't any of you forget that. At the time, it sounded like the kind of thing grieving people say. I filed it away and didn't think about it again for 2.5 years. I thought that was the end of the story. My grandfather was gone. My parents had their version. I had my life. The accounts, as far as I could see, were closed. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, my phone rang with a Virginia area code, and I looked at it for a long time before I answered. The voice on the other end was smooth and a little tired, the voice of a man reading from a file he'd read 100 times. Ms. Baker, my name is Roland Marsh. I'm an attorney representing your father in a transaction. A pause, papers moving. It's largely procedural. Your father needs your signature to close the sale of the family business. It's a little urgent. We're up against a deadline with the buyer. I hadn't heard my father's name spoken to me in 3 years. I sat down at my kitchen table. Signature for what exactly? I asked. There was a half-second pause, the kind you'd miss if you weren't listening. You have an interest that needs to be confirmed by the trustee before we can close. Standard cleanup, honestly. Ashford's counsel just wants every signature accounted for. Ashford. He said it like I should know the name. I didn't. Who's Ashford? Ashford Beverage Holdings, the buyer. Another pause. Look, I'll email you the documents. If you can sign and return by the end of next week, we'll all be in good shape. I almost said no. I almost hung up and went back to my quiet life and let them sell whatever they were selling. Instead, I heard myself say, send it. The documents came 20 minutes later. 40 pages, dense, a purchase agreement for 100% of Baker and Vine. I scrolled, not really reading, the way you skim something that has nothing to do with you. Then I hit the second page and one paragraph stopped me. Someone had highlighted it in yellow. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Someone on their side had marked this passage because someone on their side knew it was the problem. It described the ownership of the company. It referred, in the flat language of these things, to a controlling interest held in trust for the benefit of Wendy Baker. I read the second page twice, then a third time, and alone in my kitchen, with the dishwasher running and my husband grading papers in the next room, I smiled. I didn't understand all of it, but I understood enough. My father was trying to sell something that might not be his to sell, and the only person who could complete the sale for him was the daughter he'd told the whole family he'd thrown away. I didn't call my father. I want you to notice that, because it's the whole difference between the person I'd been at that dinner table and the person I'd become. The old me would have called him, furious, demanding answers, handing him the chance to make me sound hysterical. The new me made tea, sat down, and read all 40 pages. Are you going to call him? Elliot asked, standing in the doorway with a red pen still in his hand. Not until I understand exactly what I'm holding, I said. I made a chart by hand on a legal pad, the way I did with clinic budgets when something didn't add up. Who owns what? There was my father at 34%. There was, listed separately, my Aunt Harriet at 15. And then there was that controlling piece, 51%, sitting in something the documents kept calling the Gideon Baker Trust. A phrase I had never once heard spoken in my family. 51%. 34 plus 15 is 49. I sat with those numbers for a long time. Even if my father and my aunt agreed on everything, they couldn't reach control. They couldn't sell the whole company. Not without the 51. Not without whoever the 51 belonged to. I opened my wallet. It's a strange thing, muscle memory. I don't know what made me look. But there, soft at the edges, was a card I'd carried since I was 14 and moved from wallet to wallet without ever really seeing it. Emmett Shaw. And a phone number. If anything's ever wrong and you can't reach me, you call this man. I called him the next morning. Emmett Shaw's office was in an old brick building in Charlottesville, the kind of law office that still has real books on the shelves. I flew in from Nashville, a 90-minute flight and a lifetime, and I sat across a wide desk from a man in his 70s with careful hands and a face that changed when I told him my name. Wendy, he said. Not Ms. Baker. Wendy. I wondered if you'd ever call that number. I put the purchase agreement on his desk, open to the highlighted page. I need you to tell me what this means. In plain words, I manage a vet clinic, not a hedge fund. He didn't reach for the document. He already knew what it said. He folded his hands and looked at me for a moment, the way my grandfather used to, and then he told me. Your grandfather left you the controlling interest in Baker and Vine. 51%. He did it a few months before he died. I drafted it myself. A pause. He signed it with that black fountain pen he never let anyone borrow. Wouldn't use anything else. Said a signature was a promise. The room went very quiet. I heard a clock somewhere. He put it in a trust, Emmett went on. For your benefit, with me as trustee. That's the 51% your father is trying to sell out from under you. He can't. Legally, he cannot close that sale without you, because he doesn't control the company. You do. I had prepared myself, on the flight, for a lot of things. I had not prepared myself for that. Not for the fountain pen. Not for a few months before he died, which meant he'd done it after that December dinner, after he'd watched what they did to me, after they'd pushed me out. I'd thought his silence at that kitchen table when I was 18 was just a kind old man letting a stubborn girl have her way. It wasn't. He'd been watching. He'd been deciding. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked. My voice was steadier than I expected. He died 2.5 years ago. Why am I only hearing this now? Emmett looked down at his desk. For the first time, the careful man looked ashamed. I sent the notice, he said. The law requires it. When a trust like this takes effect, the beneficiary has to be notified. I sent it to the address your father gave me. He opened a drawer, and he took out a copy of a letter and an envelope, and he laid them in front of me. The envelope was stamped in red. Return to sender. I looked at the address. It was a place I had never lived in my life. Your father told me you'd cut off contact, Emmett said quietly. Changed your number, moved, wanted nothing to do with the family. He said he'd be the bridge, that he'd get you the information himself, keep it in the family, spare everyone the lawyers. I believed him. I trusted him to be the bridge. He shook his head slowly. That was my mistake, and I have carried it every day since. I should have found you myself. I let a man I've known 40 years tell me a lie because it was easier than doubting him. There it was, not an accident, not an oversight. My father had given a false address to the one person who could have told me the truth, and then he'd spent 2.5 years running a company he no longer controlled, telling the family I'd been disowned, waiting, I suppose, for a day when he'd need one small signature from a daughter who'd never know why it mattered. There's someone else you should talk to, Emmett said. Your Aunt Harriet. She suspected something was wrong since the funeral. She never had proof. But she knew your grandfather, and she knew he wouldn't have left things the way everyone said he did. I drove out to Harriet's that afternoon, to a farmhouse at the edge of the vineyards where she'd lived her whole life. She owned 15% of the company and a lifetime of watching my father operate, and when she opened the door and saw me, her hand went to her mouth. Oh, she said. Oh, you found out. We sat in her kitchen. She made coffee she didn't drink, and she told me she'd known, at the funeral, that something was off. My grandfather had talked to her in his last months, had told her he was taking care of the thing that mattered, had told her that Wendy was the one who understood what the winery was for. When the will was read that October, and it only mentioned vaguely the most deserving, and everyone in the room turned and looked at my father and nodded, Harriet had felt the wrongness of it in her gut. But she was old, and she was scared, and she had 15% and no allies, and she told herself it wasn't her place. I told myself that for 2.5 years, she said, that it wasn't my place. I was wrong, and I've hated myself for it every day. You deserve to know. I let them make you the villain, and I said nothing. Then she got up, and she went to a drawer, and she took out a letter. He gave me this, she said, before he died. He told me if it ever came to it, if anyone ever forgot, I was to make sure you understood why. Not just what. Why. The paper was soft, the edges gone slightly yellow. I unfolded it and read the first line, in my grandfather's slanted hand. If you're reading this, someone forgot what I never did. I folded it back up. I couldn't read the rest, not there, not out loud, not with Harriet watching me, and her coffee going cold. Some things you have to be alone for. I want to pause here, because I know you're waiting to see what happens when I walk into that room. If this story is landing for you, if you've ever been the one they called selfish for wanting what was promised to you, do me a favor and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it tells the people who did this that stories like ours don't just disappear. Now let me tell you about my father's phone call. He called me 2 days after I got back to Nashville. First time in 3 years I'd heard his voice. He didn't know I'd met Emmett. He didn't know I'd sat in Harriet's kitchen. As far as my father knew, I was still the strong one, the useful one, the daughter who'd fold because folding was what I did. And so he called me the way you'd call an employee you were mildly annoyed with. Wendy, it's your father. A beat, as if I might have forgotten. Look, I know things have been complicated, but this is business. The lawyer sent you papers. I need you to sign them and send them back. The buyer's waiting, and this deadline is real. The buyer's waiting. As if the buyer's schedule were the natural order of the universe, and I was a small obstacle in its path. I read the papers, I said. Good, then you know it's just cleanup. Sign at the tabs, we all move on. A pause. Let's not make this dramatic, Wendy. It doesn't have to be a whole thing. There is a specific feeling that comes when someone underestimates you so completely that they don't even bother to be careful. It isn't anger exactly. It's a kind of clarity. I'll be there, I said. I meant something very different from what he heard. He heard a daughter agreeing to come sign. I heard myself deciding to walk into that room with everything I now knew. But I didn't correct him. My grandfather had a saying, grabbing hands hold nothing. My father's whole life was grabbing. I'd let him keep reaching right up until the moment his hand closed on air. My mother started texting that night. Then Reagan. They ran the same play they'd always run, and it's remarkable, when you've stepped outside a system, how clearly you can see its moving parts. Don't punish your father over old grudges, my mother wrote. This is his life's work. Don't be jealous of your sister again now, when it matters most. There it was. The word, 3 years later, reached for like a tool they'd never had to sharpen, because it had always worked before. Reagan sent a photo of the vineyard at sunset. This is our legacy, she wrote. Don't ruin it because you're still bitter. Our legacy. She'd taken the fund and called it needing help. She'd taken my reputation and called it honesty. Now she was reaching for the winery and calling it ours. And underneath all of it, still, was the assumption that I would give way. Because giving way was the only role they'd ever written for me. I didn't write back to either of them. Instead, I called a lawyer of my own, not Emmett, who represented the trust, but someone to represent me. And I asked the question that mattered most to me, the one my family would never have thought to ask. Before I decide anything, I said, tell me what happens to the 26 people who work there, if this sale goes through, if it doesn't, what happens to them? Because that was the part my father had never once mentioned. Not the winery my grandfather built from a hillside, not the people who'd worked there for decades. One of them had taught me to rack wine when I was 10 years old, standing me on an overturned crate so I could reach. To my father, the company was a number with a buyer attached. To me, it was starting to become something else, something I was responsible for, whether I'd asked to be or not. I booked a flight to Virginia for the day of the closing, and before I zipped my bag, I put one thing in it that didn't belong there. My grandfather's fountain pen. Emmett had given it to me before I left his office. It's yours now, he'd said, along with everything else. The closing was held in a conference room at Ashford's regional office, a glass-walled place that smelled like new carpet and cold coffee. I want to describe the room to you the way I saw it walking in, because the room told the whole story before anyone said a word. My father sat at the head of the table with the confidence of a man who owned it. My mother beside him, dressed for an occasion. Reagan next to her, on her phone. Ashford's attorney at one side, a stack of tabbed documents squared in front of her. Emmett at the other side, quiet, his hands folded. Harriet near the end, small and upright, watching me come in with something in her eyes I can only call hope. And there was a chair left for me at the very foot of the table, the seat farthest from my father, the place you'd put someone who didn't matter. Even now, even trying to sell the company, they'd sat me where they'd always sat me. I sat down. My father slid a stack of papers down the length of the table toward me, and it stopped just short of my hands. Sign at the tabs, he said. Then we can all move on. Ashford's attorney gave me a professional smile and pushed a pen across the table. A cheap black rollerball with the buyer's logo on it. I didn't pick it up. I reached into my bag, and I took out my grandfather's fountain pen, and I set it on the table in front of me, uncapped, where everyone could see it. My father's eyes went to it. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, and under it, the first thin thread of doubt. Before I sign anything, I said, I want to make sure I understand what I'm signing. This is a sale of 100% of the company. That's right, Ashford's attorney said. To do that, you need 100% of the ownership to agree. I looked at my father. You own 34%, Dad. Aunt Harriet owns 15. That's 49. I let the numbers sit in the room. Who owns the rest? My father's jaw tightened. It's held in trust. It's a formality. That's what your signature is for. Held in trust for whom? The room was very quiet. Ashford's attorney, who had clearly read every page of her own agreement, flipped, almost involuntarily, to the second page. The highlighted page. She already knew the answer. She'd known it before any of us walked in. For me, I said. Grandpa left the controlling interest to me, 51%. You can't sell what you don't own. And Dad, the part that decides everything? You don't own it. I do. I have replayed the next few seconds more times than I can count, and what strikes me is how little sound there was. No one gasped. My mother didn't cry. My father didn't shout. The power in that room simply shifted, quietly and completely, like water finding its level, and everyone felt it move. That's not, my father started. That codicil, or trust, or whatever it isn't valid. He wasn't. It's valid, Emmett said. He didn't raise his voice. He'd been waiting 2.5 years to say this, I think, and he said it gently, which somehow made it worse. I drafted it, Warren. Gideon signed it in front of me, in sound mind, 4 months before he passed. It's been valid the entire time, he paused. And I told you, 2.5 years ago, I told you it existed. You said you'd handle it. You said you'd be the bridge. My father's face did something complicated. My mother turned to look at him, and I watched her understand, in real time, that this was not news to him, that he had known. That the story she'd helped him tell the whole family, the disowned daughter, the greedy girl, had been built on top of a thing he'd been hiding all along. You knew, my mother said, very quietly. Not to me, to him. I didn't answer her. He looked at me instead, and he tried, one more time, the only move he had left. Wendy, sweetheart, this is family. The buyer is offering $7.6 million. That's life-changing money for all of us. For your sister. Don't let something from years ago cost this family its future. Don't do this out of... He stopped himself. But I knew the word. We all knew the word. Out of jealousy? I finished for him. Say it. You've never had any trouble saying it before. I didn't say it. For the first time in my life, my father couldn't finish a sentence he'd started because the word he needed had finally run out of power in a room where the facts were on the table. Reagan spoke then, from her mother's side, the way she always had, jumping in before the silence could settle. So you are jealous. She said it like it still meant something, like it was still a weapon. The sentence dropped onto the table and nobody picked it up. It just lay there, small and dead, and everyone looked at it, and for the first time in 29 years I felt no urge at all to defend myself against it. Ashford's attorney cleared her throat. Ms. Baker, as the controlling interest holder, do you consent to this sale? I looked around the table. At my father, who'd hidden a letter behind a false address. At my mother, the family's storyteller, who'd written me out and was only now learning the story had a page she hadn't seen. At Reagan, who still thought this was about who deserved more. At Harriet, upright and hopeful. At Emmett, and at the fountain pen lying uncapped in front of me, my grandfather's promise, waiting to see what I'd do with it. I recapped the pen. No, I said. I don't consent. I'm not signing this. Not today, not for this buyer, not for $7.6 million. I looked at my father. This isn't yours to give away. It never was. Ashford's attorney gathered her papers with the brisk efficiency of someone who deals dead deals every week. She was professional about it. She said her firm would need to withdraw pending clear ownership, and she was gone within 10 minutes, and the sale my father had built his last 2.5 years around walked out the door with her. The email came the next morning, formal and final. Ashford was withdrawing. Without a clean chain of ownership, there was no deal. And, as Emmett pointed out to me quietly, There never legally could have been. My father had been trying to sell the sky. It should have felt like winning. Mostly it felt like standing in the wreckage of something and realizing you now had to decide what to do with all of it. Because here is what my father hadn't told anyone. The reason he'd needed the sale so badly wasn't retirement, or a golden offer, or a graceful exit. It was debt. He'd made a bad investment years back, and had been quietly bleeding money ever since, and he'd been counting on the sale to cover the hole. Without it, the winery was still standing, but it was leaning, and now it was leaning under me. I could have walked away. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's the most important choice I made. I owned 51% of a company in trouble, run by a man who'd wronged me, in a family that had thrown me out. The clean revenge, the movie version, would have been to let it all collapse and go home to Nashville and let them live in the ruins. I didn't, and not because I'm a saint. I'm not. I didn't do it for my father. I did it for the row of vines my grandfather planted with his hands, and for the man who taught me to rack wine standing on a crate, and for 26 people who'd done nothing wrong and would have lost their jobs so my father could pay for his mistake. I brought in a professional manager, someone with no last name in this family and no stake in its old wars, to actually run the business day to day. I kept Harriet close. Her 15% and her 40 years of watching turned out to be worth more than anyone had ever given her credit for. And I gave my father a role. A limited one. An advisory seat, with a title and no authority, because firing him entirely would have hurt the company's standing in the region, and because, I'll admit it, some quiet part of me wanted him to have to sit at a table he no longer controlled and watch it run well without him. The people here keep their jobs, I told the manager on my first real day. That part isn't negotiable, everything else we can talk about. The man who'd taught me to rack wine was still there, grayer, slower. He shook my hand in the yard and held it a second longer than a handshake needs. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. There was one thing left that I couldn't restructure or delegate. The story. Somewhere out there, a whole family still believed I'd been disowned for greed, and for 3 years I'd let them, because I'd thought it was harmless. I knew better now. Harriet fixed it in the end, and she did it in the only way that would have worked. Not with an argument, but with my grandfather's own words. There was a small family gathering that spring. The kind of thing that happens after a funeral has faded, and people start pretending to be normal with each other again. Harriet asked me if she could read the letter aloud. I said yes. I was ready by then. I'd read the rest of it, alone, and I'll come to that. She stood up at the table, this small, upright woman, and she read my grandfather's letter to the relatives who had spent 3 years believing the loudest voices in the room. I watched their faces change. I watched Delia, the cousin who told me disowning me was kind, go still and pale as she understood what she'd signed her name to without ever asking me a single question. After, Delia found me by the door. "We got it wrong," she said. "Didn't we?" "You believed the people who told it loudest," I said. "It wasn't cruel, it was just true. That's the whole engine of a family like mine. The one who yells writes the history. The one who goes quiet gets written out of it." I didn't need her apology, and I think she understood that, and I think it landed harder on her than anything I could have said. Reagan texted me that night. "I'll give you the whole thing, because it tells you exactly who she is and exactly who she isn't. I was a kid too, okay? Mom and Dad did this, not me. Don't act like you're better than me. I didn't ask for any of it." I read it standing in Harriet's guest room. And here's the strange thing. Part of it was true. She had been young. She had been raised to be the center of a family that needed a center to orbit, and that does its own kind of damage. A person built to always receive never learns how to give. In another life I might have felt for her. But she hadn't just received the fund. She'd taken my name and spread the word disowned through the family like she was doing everyone a favor. She'd looked at my empty wedding chairs and posted about our legacy. She was a grown woman now, texting me to explain why none of it was her fault, and I noticed she still hadn't asked me one single question about how any of it had been for me. I set the phone face down on the nightstand. I didn't reply. Some apologies never come, and the freedom, the real freedom, is in learning to stop standing by the door waiting for them. Let me tell you what the rest of the letter said. I read it alone, the night after the closing, in a hotel room in Charlottesville, with the fountain pen on the desk beside me. If you're reading this, someone forgot what I never did. You were 18 when you pushed my check back across the table and told me you'd rather earn it. Everyone at that table thought you were foolish. I thought you were the only one of them I could trust. A person who won't take what she hasn't earned is the only kind of person you can safely hand something to. Everybody else in this family has grabbing hands when you never did. I'm not leaving you the company because I feel sorry for how they treat you. I'm leaving it to you because you're the one who'll hold it right. Not clutch it. Hold it. There's a difference, and you're the only one who ever understood it. Grabbing hands hold nothing. Remember the old vine. It outlives everyone who forgets who planted it. I sat with that for a long time, because it reframed everything, all the way back to the beginning. The thing my family had called jealousy, called selfishness, called making everything about me. My refusal, at 18 to grab, was the exact thing my grandfather had trusted. The trait they'd punished me for my whole life was the trait he'd handed me a company on the strength of. I'd spent 25 years believing that if I was just good enough, my parents would finally see my value. And the truth, the whole graceless truth, was that my value had been seen all along by the one person in that family who mattered and recorded in ink with a fountain pen 4 months before he died. It had never been in question. It had only been hidden. I kept the company. That surprised some people who expected me to sell it, out of spite or out of exhaustion. But selling would have meant handing it to grabbing hands, and I wasn't going to do that. I run it from Nashville mostly, through the manager and through Harriet, and through regular trips to Virginia to walk the rows and check the books. I didn't move back. I didn't have to move into their world to own my part of it. I did sign one thing with my grandfather's pen, the paperwork appointing the new manager. My first real act as the person who held the 51%, and I chose, for that signature, to make it a promise instead of a surrender. A signature is a promise. I finally understood what he'd meant. For my whole life, my family had used my signature, my agreement, my going along, as a way to take. This was the first time it was mine to give. My father reached out eventually. Not an apology exactly. My father isn't built for those. More of an opening, maybe we could talk sometime. The kind of thing a proud man says when he's run out of other moves. I thought about it for a while. You can be in the business, Dad, I told him. You can't be back in charge of me. Those are two different things, and I'm never going to confuse them again. That's where he sits now, in the business, at the edge of it, with a title and a chair and no authority, watching a company run well without his grabbing hands on it. I don't know if that's punishment or mercy. Maybe it's both. Maybe with some people that's the only honest place to land. My mother never said anything at all. The storyteller, in the end, simply had no story left that anyone would buy, and she went quiet, which for her may have been the hardest consequence of all. And Reagan and I don't speak. That door is closed. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it the way you note the weather. Some doors close, and you stop mistaking the closing for your fault. I did take the do not answer label off my father's number. I put his real name back. A small thing, controlled. A door left open exactly 1 inch and no more. Not forgiveness. Just an acknowledgement that a person can change position without changing places. It was May when I finally opened the bottle. Elliot and I were home in Nashville, on the crooked porch we loved, and I took down the reserve with my grandfather's initials etched in the glass, the one I'd carried unopened through 3 years and a death and a war I hadn't known I was fighting. I'd been waiting all that time for a day worth remembering. This was it. The cork came out clean. I poured 2 glasses, not 2 empty chairs, 2 full glasses, and I thought about the oldest row, and the man who planted it, and the hand he used to lay flat against the trunk. They spent 3 years deciding I didn't matter. I spent one afternoon in a conference room learning I'd never once needed their vote. That's the part no one tells you about being written out of a family. They think erasing your name is the end of you. But a name in the wrong hands was never where your worth was written. Mine was recorded somewhere they couldn't reach, in a hand steadier than theirs, by a man who saw me clearly when no one else bothered to look. And the day I finally understood that, I stopped needing any of them to sign off on who I was. The old vine outlives everyone who forgets who planted it. I don't forget, I never will, and I don't need anyone's permission to be worth what I've always been worth.